In this module, you will be introduced to features, tools for managing and deploying Azure resources. You will learn about the Azure portal, a graphic interface for managing Azure resources, command line, and scripting tools that help deploy or configure resources. You will also learn about Azure services that help you manage your on-premises and multi-cloud environment from Azure. Learning objectives. After completing this module, you will be able to describe Azure portal, describe Azure Cloud Shell, including Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell, describe the purpose of Azure Arc, describe Azure Resource Manager, ARM, and Azure ARM templates. To get the most out of Azure, you need a way to interact with the Azure environment, the management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, resources, and so on. Azure provides multiple tools for managing your environment, including the Azure Portal, Azure PowerShell, Azure Command Line Interface, CLI. What is the Azure Portal? The Azure Portal is a web-based, unified console that provides an alternative to command line tools. With the Azure Portal, you can manage your Azure subscription by using a graphical user interface. You can build, manage, and monitor everything from simple web apps to complex cloud deployments, create custom dashboards for an organized view of resources, configure accessibility options for an optimal experience. The following video introduces you to the Azure Portal.
The Azure Portal is your one-stop graphical management solution for creating, configuring, and controlling all your Azure services and subscriptions. The portal makes it easy to create resources through a wizard-like environment, from something as simple as a website to a geographically redundant database, to a full Kubernetes cluster. Once you have resources created, the portal lets you adjust the various parameters and settings for your resources, add users to your cloud-based Active Directory, implement security policies, and plan backup schedules. You can personalize your portal experience through custom dashboards that you create to see the data that is most important to you. Within the portal, you can start and stop services as needed. You can scale your services by adding or removing resources from your subscription, according to your business needs. You can also monitor the health of your applications, track your costs and billing status, analyze the performance of your applications in real time, or create reports for in-depth analysis. The Azure Portal is your gateway to managing everything in your Azure subscription, whether you are creating new resources, configuring existing resources, or controlling Azure services. The Azure Portal is your place to manage your company's business on Azure.
The Azure Portal is designed for resiliency and continuous availability. It maintains a presence in every Azure data center. This configuration makes the Azure Portal resilient to individual data center failures and avoids network slowdowns by being close to users. The Azure Portal updates continuously and requires no downtime for maintenance activities. Azure Cloud Shell. Azure Cloud Shell is a browser-based shell tool that allows you to create, configure, and manage Azure resources using a shell. Azure Cloud Shell support both Azure PowerShell and the Azure Command Line Interface, CLI, which is a bash shell. You can access Azure Cloud Shell via the Azure Portal by selecting the Cloud Shell icon. Azure Cloud Shell has several features that make it a unique offering to support you in managing Azure. Some of those features are: it is a browser-based shell experience, with no local installation or configuration required. It is authenticated to your Azure credentials, so when you log in it inherently knows who you are and what permissions you have. You choose the shell you're most familiar with. Azure Cloud Shell supports both Azure PowerShell and the Azure CLI, which uses bash. What is Azure PowerShell? Azure PowerShell is a shell with which developers, DevOps, and IT professionals can run commands called commandlets, commandlets. These commands call the Azure REST API to perform management tasks in Azure. Commandlets can be run independently to handle one-off changes, or they may be combined to help orchestrate complex actions such as the routine setup, teardown, and maintenance of a single resource or multiple connected resources. The deployment of an entire infrastructure, which might contain dozens or hundreds of resources, from imperative code Capturing the commands in a script makes the process repeatable and automatable. In addition to be available via Azure Cloud Shell, you can install and configure Azure PowerShell on Windows, Linux, and Mac platforms. What is the Azure CLI? The Azure CLI is functionally equivalent to Azure PowerShell, with the primary difference being the syntax of commands. While Azure PowerShell uses PowerShell commands, the Azure CLI uses Bash commands. The Azure CLI provides the same benefits of handling discrete tasks or orchestrating complex operations through code. It's also installable on Windows, Linux, and Mac platforms, as well as through Azure Cloud Shell. Due to the similarities in capabilities and access between Azure PowerShell and the Bash-based Azure CLI, it mainly comes down to which language you're most familiar with. Managing hybrid and multi-cloud environments can rapidly get complicated. Azure provides a host of tools to provision, configure, and monitor Azure resources. What about the on-premises resources in a hybrid configuration or the cloud resources in a multi-cloud configuration? In utilizing Azure Resource Manager, ARC lets you extend your Azure compliance and monitoring to your hybrid and multi-cloud configurations. Azure Arc simplifies governance and management by delivering a consistent multi-cloud and on-premises management platform. Azure Arc provides a centralized, unified way to manage your entire environment together by projecting your existing non-Azure resources into ARM. Manage multi-cloud and hybrid virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, and databases as if they are running in Azure. Use familiar Azure services and management capabilities, regardless of where they live. Continue using traditional IT ops while introducing DevOps practices to support new cloud and native patterns in your environment. Configure custom locations as an abstraction layer on top of Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters and cluster extensions. What can Azure Arc do outside of Azure? Currently, Azure Arc allows you to manage the following resource types hosted outside of Azure: servers, Kubernetes clusters, Azure Data Services, SQL Server, virtual machines. Preview. Azure Resource Manager, ARM, is the deployment and management service for Azure. It provides a management layer that enables you to create, update, and delete resources in your Azure account. Anytime you do anything with your Azure resources, ARM is involved. When a user sends a request from any of the Azure tools, APIs, or SDKs, ARM receives the request. ARM authenticates and authorizes the request. Then, ARM sends the request to the Azure service, which takes the requested action. You see consistent results and capabilities in all the different tools because all requests are handled through the same API. Azure Resource Manager benefits. With Azure Resource Manager, you can manage your infrastructure through declarative templates rather than scripts. A Resource Manager template is a JSON file that defines what you want to deploy to Azure. Deploy, manage, and monitor all the resources for your solution as a group, rather than handling these resources individually. Redeploy your solution throughout the development lifecycle and have confidence your resources are deployed in a consistent state. Define the dependencies between resources, so they are deployed in the correct order. Apply access control to all services because ABAC is natively integrated into the management platform. Apply tags to resources to logically organize all the resources in your subscription. Clarify your organization's billing by viewing costs for a group of resources that share the same tag. The following video provides an overview of how you can use different Azure tools with ARM to manage your environment.
Azure Resource Manager has several features that you can use to organize resources, enforce standards, and protect your critical Azure resources from accidental deletion. Resource groups are containers for resources deployed on Azure. By placing resources of similar usage, type, or location in the same resource group, you can provide some order and organization to your Azure resources. Tags allow you to improve the organization of your resources even further. You can use tags to associate custom details with a resource or resource group such as a cost center or billing department. Resource groups and tags are great for helping you organize existing resources or groups. But how do you make sure that new resources follow the same rules? You can use Azure policies to ensure that new resources use the same tags as existing resources, keeping things organized. How do you protect your resources once they've been deployed? Role-based access control provides fine-grained access management for your Azure resources, allowing you to grant users the specific rights they need to perform their jobs. IT personnel can manage settings, developers can have read-only access, and administrators can have complete control all at the same time. You can even prevent resources from being deleted accidentally. By enabling resource locks, you can block the ability to delete a resource or prevent changes to it by marking it as read-only. Azure Resource Manager provides you with the tools you need to keep your resources organized and secure.
ARM templates. Infrastructure as code is a concept where you manage your infrastructure as lines of code. Leveraging Azure Cloud Shell, Azure PowerShell, or the Azure CLI are some examples of using code to deploy cloud infrastructure. ARM templates are another example of infrastructure as code at work. By using ARM templates, you can describe the resources you want to use in a declarative JSON format. With an ARM template, the deployment code is verified before any code is run. This ensures that the resources will be created and connected correctly. The template then orchestrates the creation of those resources in parallel. That is, if you need 50 instances of the same resource, all 50 instances are created at the same time. Ultimately, the developer, DevOps professional, or IT professional needs only to define the desired state and configuration of each resource in the ARM template, and the template does the rest. Templates can even execute PowerShell and Bash scripts before or after the resource has been set up. Benefits of using ARM templates. ARM templates provide many benefits when planning for deploying Azure resources. Some of those benefits include declarative syntax. ARM templates allow you to create and deploy an entire Azure infrastructure declaratively. Declarative syntax means you declare what you want to deploy but don't need to write the actual programming commands and sequence to deploy the resources. Repeatable results. Repeatedly deploy your infrastructure throughout the development lifecycle and have confidence your resources are deployed in a consistent manner. You can use the same ARM template to deploy multiple dev/test environments, knowing that all the environments are the same. Orchestration. You don't have to worry about the complexities of ordering operations. Azure Resource Manager orchestrates the deployment of interdependent resources, so they are created in the correct order. When possible, Azure Resource Manager deploys resources in parallel, so your deployments finish faster than serial deployments. You deploy the template through one command, rather than through multiple imperative commands. Modular files. You can break your templates into smaller, reusable components and link them together at deployment time. You can also nest one template inside another template. For example, you could create a template for a VM stack, and then nest that template inside of templates that deploy entire environments, and that VM stack will consistently be deployed in each of the environment templates. Extensibility. With deployment scripts, you can add PowerShell or Bash scripts to your templates. The deployment scripts extend your ability to set up resources during deployment. A script can be included in the template or stored in an external source and referenced in the template. Deployment scripts give you the ability to complete your end-to-end environment setup in a single ARM template. What service helps you manage your Azure, on-premises, and multi-cloud environments? What service helps you manage your Azure, on-premises, and multi-cloud environments? What two components could you use to implement a infrastructure as code deployment? In this module, you were introduced to features and tools for managing and deploying Azure resources. You learned about the Azure portal, a graphic interface for managing Azure resources, command line, and scripting tools that help deploy or configure resources. You also learned about Azure services that help you manage your on-premises and multi-cloud environment from Azure. Learning objectives: you should now be able to describe Azure portal, describe Azure Cloud Shell, including Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell, describe the purpose of Azure Arc, describe Azure Resource Manager, ARM, and Azure ARM templates.